Colonel Rob Maness has a lifelong record of providing dedicated service to this nation. Having worked his way up from the enlisted ranks to full colonel, he served our country for more than 32 years. He has served as a bomber squadron commander, bomb disposal technician, Joint Chiefs of Staff Operations Officer, assisted the National Security Team with the campaign plan for the global war on terrorism. He authored the first theater nuclear war plan and served as the Vice Commander of America's largest airborne intelligence wing. Colonel Rob Maness is a true American hero. This is Rob Maness Live.
Sure good to see you. How's life treating you today?
Well, Saul, it's been a pretty touch and go situation. Linda and I have had quite a few unpleasant words here lately over the deal with that he hired Mike Wallace to assassinate the president. It's been hectic in every way, but we've lived through it this far, and I guess we'll continue to do so. Lyndon should have never issued that order to Mike, but we've had our differences, and I'm a true blue to Lyndon, as I've always been, and tried to carry out every order that he's ever given me. But this is one I'll probably never be able to forget. And the times that we've had in Texas, and the embarrassment that Lyndon had gotten from Kennedy, I guess there wasn't anything else to do but what he did.
Well, you know, Lyndon could have really hit me if he would.
Well, Lyndon's the kind of person that doesn't want to help anyone. He's all for Lyndon, and that's the way he's pretty much always been.
Well, they had me backed up on that Henry Marshall killing, and they just, it's sure good to see you. How's life? It's sure good to see you. How's life treating you today?
The Real Killers of John F. Kennedy. Well, the Rob Maness Show is live on Worldview Tube and our X Spaces simulcast, and I'm honored and humbled to have Roger Stone as my guest today. Roger is not only a political icon, but in my mind, the best political operative and strategist in my lifetime. He's a New York Times bestselling author, a Trump loyalist, and host of the Stone Zone on WABC Radio. The first person anyone should want to discuss the Kennedy assassination papers drop with is this man. In his book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, Mr. Stone, and I'll quote one of the assessments of the book, makes a compelling case that Lyndon Baines Johnson had the motive, means, and opportunity to orchestrate the murder of JFK. He maps out the case that LBJ blackmailed his way onto the ticket in 1960 and was being dumped in 64 to face prosecution for corruption at the hands of his nemesis, attorney Robert Kennedy. Mr. Stone uses fingerprint evidence and testimony to prove JFK was shot by a longtime LBJ hitman, not Lee Harvey Oswald. President Johnson would use power from his personal connections in Texas, from the criminal underworld, and from the United States government to escape an untimely end in politics and to seize even greater power. Johnson, the 36th president of the United States, was the driving force behind a conspiracy to murder President Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, close quote. Well, Roger Stone, welcome to the Rob Maness Show, sir.
Rob, I'm really delighted and honored to be here.
Like I said, I can't thank you enough. I know your time is very valuable. Before we jump into that video, now that it's been some time has passed, I think almost 2 weeks now, since these Kennedy files have been dumped, have you had a chance to go through them? And did they really release everything that we think we know is out there?
Rob, I have had a chance to go through them, and the problem is that they're woefully incomplete. There are documents, videos, audios, and other pieces of evidence that we know the Assassination Records Review Board, a federal body set up in the 1990s, reviewed, that were not among those things released. The House Special Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 70s concluded, after an exhaustive investigation that organized crime played a very substantial role in John Kennedy's murder. Lyndon Johnson has many ties to them. Talk about that later. But not a single document, not a single piece of evidence released by the National Archives in this recent dump addresses the question of organized crime. Just use that as one example. So I think what they have done here is to cherry pick documents without obtaining everything from the Secret Service, everything from the Internal Revenue Service, everything from the Department of State, everything from the Department of Defense, everything from Army Intelligence, just to name a few, to try to bolster the false narrative that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. He was alone, not a Russian communist, that he fired 3 shots from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository building. A feat, by the way, no government marksman has ever been able to duplicate. It's a false narrative, but they continue to prop it up. Now, the one area where I think there's a little bit of a breakthrough is, at a minimum, these new documents prove that the CIA had much earlier knowledge of Oswald and his movements. The CIA is well aware of the fact that a man claiming to be Oswald does not make the physical identity of the Oswald who showed up at the Mexican embassy seeking passage to Cuba. They also know that a man using the name Oswald goes to various air charter services in Dallas the day before the assassination to inquire how much it would cost to charter a plane to fly to Cuba. The problem is that when the air charter service companies are shown a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald, they all say, no, that's not the man I saw. So the CIA is busted in the sense that it is exposed that they know about Oswald far earlier than they say they do, but there are huge pieces missing here. The involvement of organized crime, and of course, all of the evidence that points to the fact that Malcolm Mac Wallace is at least one of the shooters of John F. Kennedy. Why do we say this? Well, first of all, Wallace's fingerprints are found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. They're found on the window encasement, and they're also found on the cardboard boxes that fashion the so-called crow's nest from which the alleged shooter shot. 6 different witnesses tell either the Dallas police or the FBI that they see a man in the window on the 6th floor who meets the physical description of Wallace: middle-aged, balding, wearing spectacles, heavy set, wearing a tan jacket and light-colored trousers. That is not 27-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald wearing a T-shirt. So the evidence is now been compounded by that audio which you just played. For those who don't recognize the players, let me lay it out. Billy Sol Estes was a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer and crony of Lyndon Johnson. Johnson was specifically under investigation by Attorney General Robert Kennedy for taking kickbacks from Billy Sol. Billy Sol ultimately went to prison, took the fall for Lyndon Johnson. When he got out of prison, he spit out the truth under oath in several instances, but he actually said after Johnson's death that he was in the room with Lyndon Johnson and Johnson's attorney, John Cofer, and others, where the assassination of John Kennedy was being planned.
Wow. So Estes, who's the voice in that audio tape? Is it Estes?
You're listening to 2 men. One is Billy Sol, but the one who makes the assertion that LBJ directed Malcolm Mac Wallace to shoot Kennedy is a man named Cliff Carter. Cliff Carter was the chief political operative for Lyndon Johnson. He held the title of executive director of the Democrat National Committee. How do we know that they are Wallace's fingerprints? Well, because in 1951, Mac Wallace was arrested and convicted of first-degree murder when he killed a man who was trying to blackmail Lyndon Johnson, a man named uh, John Douglas Kinzer, who was involved in a love triangle with Johnson's Bohemian sister and was beginning to try to blackmail Johnson over the irregularities in the 1948 election and other pieces of corruption that he'd learned about through Johnson's sister. Kinzer, by the way, died in broad daylight on a golf course. Malcolm Mac Wallace was represented at trial by Johnson's personal attorney, John Cofer, and he's the only man in the history of Texas jurisprudence to be convicted of first-degree murder and get a suspended sentence.
Wow. I was only 2 years old when this happened, but as I grew up, I've been reading about it. But this is the first time you're the first person to actually definitively come down and say LBJ is the guy. He has motive, he has opportunity, and it appears he had the players enabled, even the governor of Texas, maybe, in order to put Kennedy in the right spot at the right time in front of the gunman. Why are you so firm on that assessment? Is it just because LBJ was a crook and a slippery, powerful politician, or is it because there's more available now that we know this that makes him? He's really the only guy. Once I read what you wrote, Roger, and put it together with everything else I know, he's the only person that really does have the motive and opportunity and the resource.
Well, let me make it very clear. I'm not trying to make the case that Lyndon Johnson acting alone or acting with just the assistance of the Dallas Police Department and the Dallas Sheriff's Office, both of which he controls, killed John F. Kennedy. There is, I hate this word, a conspiracy, so let's call it a plot. There is a plot in which the Central Intelligence Agency plays a role, organized crime plays a role, Big Texas Oil plays a role. There are other entities. Everyone has their own individual motive for wanting John Kennedy dead. The Central Intelligence Agency knows, for example, that the story told to us by the Kennedys regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis is false. The missiles were never removed from Cuba. John and Robert Kennedy made a secret deal with Nikita Khrushchev to remove our missiles from Turkey and Italy, NATO missiles, changing the balance of power in the European theater. But that was classified information for 40 years. The intelligence services and the Pentagon, of course, knew it in real time. The mob's motive is very clear. In 1960, Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, who had served as ambassador to the United Kingdom under Franklin Roosevelt, and who was partners with Frank Costello, controlling all of the illegal liquor in the country from New York all the way to the Canadian border, met with all of the leaders of organized crime in Chicago, a meeting convened by Sam Giancana, who ran the mob in Chicago, and they made a deal in return for $1 million and some arm twisting in first the West Virginia Democrat primary and later on in both Illinois and in Texas. The Kennedy Justice Department was supposed to drop the deportation proceedings that were ongoing under Eisenhower against Carlos Marcello, who ran the mob in Texas and Louisiana, and Santo Traficante Sr., who ran the mob in Florida. You asked me earlier about these releases. We know, for example, that the Assassination Records Review Board listened to the audio tapes of bugs that were placed in Marcello's jail cell, where he brags about the Kennedy assassination both before it happens and after it happens. Why wasn't that among the materials that was released? Perfect example. By the way, Marcello was paying Lyndon Johnson to protect his illegal gambling operations in Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. The bag man for those transactions was a man named Jack Halfer. Halfer got a full presidential pardon on a crime that he'd been convicted of They did not relate to Lyndon Johnson. That was on November 24th, 1963. Interesting date.
Yeah, it's a very wide plot too. I'm glad you changed the conspiracy word to plot because people get thrown off by that. But it is a conspiracy. It's a real conspiracy, and I should have been more clear in my question. We got to take a break, Roger. When we come back, I'll play a little clip about the NBC tape, and just the widening of the plot includes the mainstream media, some old usual suspects that we continue to see today. And I want to talk about some of the forensics you talked about that exclude Oswald from this shooting and this assassination when we come back with Roger Stone on the Rob Maness Show on Worldview Tube.
We're actually in the process of tracking down two specific documents. And also, too, Jesse, I would like to actually tell the American people it was made aware to me this evening that NBC actually has a video that's never been seen before. We're actually going to be sending a letter requesting that from NBC because it allegedly shows Oswald near the vehicle when the assassination took place, which means that he couldn't have been the shooter. So, again, we're tracking down all this information. But look, there's even a CIA document that came out that Mr. Morley pointed out that actually said that the CIA never bought the lone gunman theory. And so I think the American people had an inclination as to what we were saying, but we never had the hard evidence until now. And so it's important to note that in a free and fair society, how could you operate or have an agency operating in the shadows? And so kudos to President Trump, also Director Radcliffe and Tulsi Gabbard for pushing for this transparency. It is going to be generational changing that they've done this. And we hope to bring forward legislation to ensure that this never happens again for future generations to come.
You're saying NBC has been keeping this tape of Oswald under wraps?
Correct. In fact, Director Stone actually told us that he was showed this tape, that it was a secondary copy, and that he said that this could blow open the entire JFK investigation. What I will also tell you, though, Jesse, is he said that NBC has been very, very much so guarding this tape. And so I believe that that tape belongs to the American people. We are going to be sending a letter asking for that tape. And I would encourage everyone to ask NBC to release that tape to the public. It's important, not just for our investigations, but so the American people know the truth as to what happened with John F. Kennedy.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show, and we're live on Worldview Tube, and we're talking about who the killers of John F. Kennedy really were with Roger Stone, who wrote a book identifying the plotters, the really coup plotters is what we would call them today, but the assassination plotters, apparently with a lot of good evidence led by LBJ and a lot of evidence that shows exactly what Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna was talking about there. A trove of evidence that shows Oswald was probably not even a trigger puller at all in that assassination attempt. And Roger, welcome back to the show. I wanted to just show that clip because it highlights one of the main suspects that we all hear about today, and that's the mainstream media. The mainstream media, NBC News, has withheld this vital information all of these years. I mean, we're not talking about the government, the CIA hiding behind classification, or Department of Defense, or the Army, or even the Dallas Police Department. It's a non-government entity. Are you surprised by that? at all?
No, actually, I've been aware of the existence of this NBC tape for a number of years. I've seen secondary copies of it. It appears that Lee Harvey Oswald is actually standing in the doorway of the Texas School Book Depository building as the motorcade goes by, which of course means it would be impossible to be for him to be shooting from the 6th floor of the same building. But there's additional evidence. First of all, the Dallas Police Department conducts a paraffin test on Lee Harvey Oswald. If he shot a leaky $26 World War II vintage Italian Army carbine, a Carcano, how is it that he has no nitrates on his chest, his arms, his face, or his hands? Could not possibly have shot a weapon that day. Secondarily, a Dallas police officer can be seen in an AP photo holding up a rifle that was found on the 6th floor. That rifle is a precision Mauser, a German rifle. It says so on the barrel. 3 different police officers, 3 different law enforcement officers signed statements that that is a rifle found. One recants, the other 2 are strangely murdered in the days almost immediately after the assassination. Then there's the claim that Oswald got off these 3 shots, had time to hide the rifle, and run down 4 flights of stairs where he was seen by a Dallas police officer calmly eating his lunch 90 seconds after the final shot. Not physically possible, but beyond that, a woman named Victoria Adams, who watched the motorcade from the 4th floor, was on the staircase, which, by the way, was a wooden staircase and therefore quite noisy, between the 4th and 2nd floor herself at the exact time that Oswald was theoretically going from the 6th floor to the 2nd floor. She neither seen, nor more importantly, she neither saw, nor more importantly, did she hear Lee Harvey Oswald. What does Oswald say when he is paraded out in public? That, by the way, in itself is rather odd. You have a man who's a murder suspect, who's alleged to have murdered the president of the United States. Why would you bring him out in public where he could be quite easily assassinated? And was. But what does he say? I'm a patsy, he says. I didn't shoot anyone. He's telling the truth. And then, of course, the Warren Commission tells us that Jack Ruby, whose real name was Jack Rubenstein, has, quote, no known associations with organized crime. Rob, this is laughable. Jack Ruby, also known as Jack Rubenstein, has worked as a button man for the mob in Chicago, has run Carlos Marcello's casino in Cuba, and the Carousel Club, which he allegedly owns. He's only fronting for the real owner, Carlos Marcello. So to say that Ruby has no connection to organized crime, this is among the more laughable jokes in the Warren Commission. The other thing I would point out to you is that Gerald Ford, then a congressman, actually the minority leader of the House from Michigan, admits to the New York Times that at the request of J. Edgar Hoover, he takes the actual autopsy diagram in the official record, and with a pencil, he erases the indications of a wound in Kennedy's upper right back and moves it to the back of his neck. That was to claim that Kennedy had been shot 3 times from the rear. A recent documentary released by Paramount, not exactly a right-wing outfit, interviews the doctors at Parkland Hospital, a surprising number of whom are still alive, and every single doctor says that they saw wounds consistent with John Kennedy being shot from the front and the back, and that the wound in his throat is an entry wound, not an exit wound. By the time Kennedy's body gets to Bethesda Medical Center, in violation of Texas state law, by the way, because state law requires an autopsy be conducted in Texas, Kennedy's body is removed at gunpoint by Secret Service agents who get into a tussle with the Texas Rangers over the body. By the time his body gets to the Bethesda Medical Center for the autopsy, there's been a tracheotomy conducted, so you can't tell whether the wound in his throat is an entry wound or an exit wound. But more importantly, the grapefruit-sized blowout wound on the left of his, on the rear right of his head has been patched. It's gone. Every doctor at Parkland says they saw it. All of the doctors at Bethesda say it's not there.
Really? I didn't realize that the gaping hole that the Bethesda doctor said it wasn't there. I mean, to me, that's the definitive proof, isn't it, that he was shot at least once or twice from the front, right?
There's also missing from the record here is the Nix film. Oliver Nix, Orville Nix, was an air conditioning repairman. Everyone has heard of the Zapruder film, an 8mm film shot by Abraham Zapruder. I prove in my book, by the way, that the government sent that to Kodak in Rochester, where frames were removed to try to accommodate the cockamamie single bullet theory that claims that Kennedy was shot 3 times from the rear, and that one bullet both went through Governor John Connally and hit John F. Kennedy. Something, by the way, that Governor John Connally denied his entire life. But the Nix film is far more valuable because Nix had a zoom lens, and therefore the Nix film that was examined by the Assassination Records Review Board would give you a much closer look at Kennedy, and I believe would prove definitively that Kennedy was shot from both the front and the back. There are multiple witnesses who tell the Warren Commission that they saw a gunman on the fence line on the grassy knoll, including one man who was working in the railroad tower, describes the car he drove up in, describes him taking a rifle out of a rifle bag, shooting. Multiple witnesses see a puff of smoke rise from the fence line on the Texas School Book Depository on the so-called grassy knoll. There's substantial evidence that Kennedy was shot from both the front and the back. I believe that there may have been as many as 4 shooters. Mac Wallace shooting from the Texas School Book Depository building, 6th floor, a shooter on the grassy knoll, most likely a Corsican, a paid assassination, flown into the country the day before, flown out of the country the same day. I think he's working for the mob. There's also, I think, a shooter in the sewer grate. Johnny Roselli, very flamboyant gangster, has often claimed that he was that shooter. Not certain about that, but I think there is a shooter there. I also think there's a shooter most likely in the Dow Tex building, which is across from the Texas School Book Depository building. This was a turkey shoot, but Kennedy was shot from both the front and the back at a minimum.
Yeah, Roger, early in my Air Force career, I was a EOD or bomb disposal technician, and I started working with the Secret Service before I was 19 years old on protective details for people all the way from President Reagan to Democrat nominees or candidates like Jesse Jackson even, and Gary Hart, George H.W. Bush, and everybody that ran against him and those kind of things. And it always surprises me when I look at the tactical layout of driving through that motorcade route. And I went to Dealey Plaza when I was stationed in Texas a couple of times just to walk it and take a look around and use the experience I had there. And it always surprises me that the Secret Service would allow that to happen, or even the Dallas Police Department, because, people that work police motorcades are familiar with what the tactics are for that. We got to take another break. When we come back, I want to talk some more about that and get your thoughts, because I think you talk about it in the book on why that happened that way. But also, we'll hear a little bit from Congresswoman Boebert in that hearing that we've talked about, that Anna Paulina Luna was talking about, and another Stone. And I want to get your take on him. That would be Oliver Stone, the director that did the documentary before your book came out. We'll be right back with Roger Stone. Who were the real killers of John F. Kennedy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Hopefully we can stay on topic for the rest of this hearing. We seem to be wrapping up pretty close here. Mr. Stone, you wrote a book accusing LBJ of being involved in the killing of President Kennedy. Did these most recent releases confirm or negate your initial charge? Being involved in the assassination of President Kennedy.
No, I didn't. In the film, if you look closely, there's no such statements. No, I didn't. If you
Yes,
look
sir.
closely at the film, there's no. It accuses the President Johnson
Okay.
of being part of a complicit in a cover-up of the case, but not in the assassination itself, which I don't know.
What do you think that he was complicit with? Yes, sir. I'll get to you.
The cover-up. Well, how about, for starters, appointing Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, who was fired by Kennedy, to the commission itself, to the Warren Commission. And he goes to almost every meeting, and he's pretty much in charge of the Warren Commission from the beginning. Alan Dulles. That's part of the evidence that points to President Johnson's either incompetence or involvement.
Mr. Morley, I think you had something to add on that.
I think you're confusing Mr. Oliver Stone with Mr. Roger Stone.
Stated it yet.
Who?
Sorry.
It's Roger Stone who implicated LBJ in the assassination of the president. It's not my friend
Is that what all the
Oliver Stone.
whispers were there? I may have misinterpreted that, and I apologize for that. But there seems to be some alluding of, like you said, incompetence or some sort of involvement there on the back end. And so sorry, I'm going to move on. Mr. Morley, I would like to talk more about.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show here on Worldview Tube and our X Spaces simulcast. My guest today is Roger Stone, the author of that book that was just being discussed there by Director Oliver Stone and Congresswoman Boebert. And Roger, I love Congresswoman Boebert. I think she's a great servant for America. And I don't want to disparage her in this by showing that clip. I wanted to show the clip to highlight what Stone said his conclusions were, and even his friend Mr. Morley there really walked that back right away as if they were afraid of it, the implication that LBJ was the leader of this plot and conspiracy that resulted in the death of President Kennedy. Why? But even so, Stone goes on to say, well, we think he's implicated in the cover-up, and then he kind of sneaks in there. I noticed it. He sneaks in that it's either incompetence or something else that's much, much more involved in this and directly implicated, I think is words he used. What did you think of that one? I'm sure you've seen that clip, but Stone's words itself.
First of all, Rob, you can't pay for publicity like that. By the way, you can get the book by going to themanwhokilledkennedy.com. Themanwhokilledkennedy.com. But if you choose to buy it elsewhere, always get the paperback version because it has 3 additional chapters that I wrote after the publication of the hardcover. Oliver Stone will not remember this, but after the publication of my book, I got a nice note from him in which he said that he wished he had read my book prior to making his film. So we aren't all that far apart. See, I believe that Lyndon Johnson planned and orchestrated the murder of Kennedy. The CIA is involved because of both the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. They both provide motive for them. Organized crime feels they have been double-crossed after helping Kennedy get elected. Attorney General Robert Kennedy seeks to move forward on the deportation of 2 of the most dangerous gangsters of the day, Santo Traficante and Carlos Marcello. Big Texas Oil is upset about the Kennedy brothers' attempts to repeal the oil depletion allowance. The banks are not unhappy. The Kennedys were pushing for a silver-backed dollar. He admits, of course, that Johnson is involved in the cover-up. I take a much broader view, saying that not only did Johnson have unique motive, means, and opportunity, but he has a unique relationship with everyone else in the conspiracy. As a Senate Majority Leader who never, ever serves on a committee, Johnson appoints himself to the subcommittee of defense appropriations, where the CIA's secret black box budgets are prepared and approved. Johnson is the paymaster for the CIA. As I said earlier, the mob was paying Lyndon Johnson to protect their gambling operations in Texas. So he has a unique nexus there. He is the chief water carrier for the Texas oil lobby in Washington, D.C. So he is uniquely connected to everyone else in this conspiracy. You did raise an excellent point. Since John Kennedy's plan was to go from the Dallas-Fort Worth airport to the Merchandise Mart, neither one of which is within the city limits of Dallas, and both of which could be reached by freeway without the car ever having to stop, why did the motorcade go into the city of Dallas, violate the Secret Service manual by taking a route that requires them to come to a full stop at a stop sign? It's pretty obvious.
Great.
Now, Governor John Connally, if you look at the book of Jerry Bruno, who was the chief advance man for JFK, that motorcade route was insisted on by Governor John Connally. And when Bruno said it would not be approved, Connally said, good, then the entire trip is canceled and our invitation to the president is rescinded, which is the only reason they agreed to drive through Dealey Plaza. Now, as you know, under the Secret Service manual, all buildings on either side of the street were supposed to be searched, cleared, and sealed, but they weren't. There were supposed to be 6 motorcycle officers, 3 abreast on either side of the presidential limousine. There was 1 motorcycle officer, and he was ordered to ride behind the presidential limousine. There were supposed to be multiple agents on the rear bumper. You can see on YouTube that several of them are ordered off. You can watch that today. So there were supposed to be plainclothes Secret Service agents in the crowd. There were none. There are so many violations of the Secret Service plan, but that's because almost immediately upon becoming vice president, Lyndon Johnson obtained the Secret Service manual and sent it to his Confederates in Texas who began planning Kennedy's murder. It's very interesting that on the inauguration day, a very, very cold day in 1961, presidential speechwriter Theodore Sorensen, the man who really wrote Profiles in Courage, a book for which John F. Kennedy got the Pulitzer Prize, he not only didn't write it, he actually never even read it, is standing next to Bobby Baker, who was the Secretary of the Senate and Johnson's right-hand man. Johnson was also under investigation in connection with payoffs that were made through Baker at the time of Kennedy's murder. And Sorensen turns to Baker and says, well, Bobby, congratulations. And Baker turns on Sorensen and says, John Kennedy will die a violent and premature death. And he storms off. There you have it.
Wow. You know, I would also add about the sealing and clearing of the buildings that all of the drainage and sewer and access points underneath the streets are supposed to be searched and sealed too. So the drainage grate should have been covered too, where that possible one shooter was at. It's incredible. The egregious, I'm not even going to call them errors. They just flat out did not follow the proper procedures and processes in this incident, and it takes very powerful and widespread group of individuals to make that happen, Roger. And the question that I've always had since I first started studying this as a kid was why Allen Dulles, the guy that President Kennedy fired from the CIA, is on that Warren Commission. It's always given me suspicion about that.
Here's the best part. After the death of Robert Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson is asked, why did you appoint Allen Dulles to the Warren Commission, knowing Dulles' hatred for JFK and the fact that JFK had fired him over the botched Bay of Pigs invasion? And Johnson said, I appointed him to the commission at the request of Robert Kennedy, which is quite obviously a lie. It's interesting, of course, also that none of the members of the Warren Commission took that as a full-time assignment. So they were mostly, with the exception of Dulles, they were mostly honorific. Chief Justice Warren did not want to chair the commission. He was talked into it by Johnson, who was basically implied that Kennedy had been killed by the Russians, and if this was not handled properly by the commission, it could lead to World War III. I don't need to tell you, there's no evidence whatsoever that the Russians or the Cubans were involved in the murder of JFK. On top of that, you have the interesting anecdote that's in the oral history of a man named Malcolm Kilduff. Malcolm Kilduff was the assistant press secretary for John F. Kennedy. The president's press secretary, Pierre Salinger, was not in Dallas that day. He had remained in Washington. It is Kilduff you can hear in the legendary audio and video announcing Kennedy's death. He records that immediately after that, he was on the elevator with the new president, Lyndon Johnson, and he says to him, Mr. President, who would kill our president? Who would do such a horrible thing? And Johnson says, it was a communist, son. And Kilduff says to Johnson, a communist? What kind of communist? Johnson says, it was a Russian communist, son. There's only one problem. Lee Harvey Oswald has not yet been apprehended. How could Johnson know that?
That's incredible. I did not know about that conversation. Something else that I wasn't aware of either is that, I think most people know that you worked for Richard Nixon and were his trusted confidant, advisor, and everything. Did President Nixon ever talk about the Kennedy assassination? I mean, he was at the national level of politics well before Kennedy won the presidency, obviously competed with him.
Well, in fact, that was the impetus and the motivation for me to write my book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, because in the late 80s, when I was working for President Nixon, I'd worked for him when I was much younger. I worked in the 1972 campaign. I was the youngest member of the staff, but I actually only had occasion to meet the president one time. It was not until the late 1970s and 1980 when working for Governor Ronald Reagan in his presidential campaign, I got the choice assignment of briefing President Nixon once a week, either in his office at 26 Federal Plaza in New York or at his home in Saddle River, New Jersey, on the campaign. So I saw the president essentially once a week for almost 8 months in 1980, late 1979 and 1980. So it was during that period that I became friendly and much closer to him. And of course, as I have recorded, Nixon was not very retrospective or introspective. He was very forward-looking. It was very hard to get him to talk about the past, whether it was his friendship with John Kennedy, whether it was being stoned by a communist mob in Venezuela, or about the famous kitchen debate with Kennedy, or what Eisenhower was really like, or his relationship with Joe McCarthy. A lot there that would have been interesting, but it was very hard to get him to talk about it until he had a couple cocktails. He was very proud of his martini making skills. And one day after we were finished working, going through invitations and trying to determine what to regret and what he might consider, he asked me if I'd like a drink. I said yes. He shook up a couple of his legendary martinis. And it was then that I took the opportunity to ask him point blank. I said, sir, may I ask you a question? He said, of course. I said, who really killed John Kennedy? He stared intently into his martini glass. And he looked up to me and he said, well, let me put it to you this way. The Warren Commission was the biggest goddamn hoax in American history. I said, I'm sorry, sir. I'm not sure what you mean. He said, let me put it another way. Lyndon and I both wanted to be president, but the difference was I wasn't willing to kill for it. He further said that when he saw Jack Ruby on television, along with millions of others, shoot and kill Lee Harvey Oswald, he immediately recognized Ruby as Jack Rubenstein because Murray Schotner, who's really the first political consultant, as it were, the guy who orchestrated Nixon's 6-year rise from leaving the U.S. Navy all the way to being vice president in just 6 years, 4 years in the House, 2 years in the Senate, and on to the national ticket. Chotiner had been a mob lawyer prior to his political involvement, and he brought Jack Ruby to Nixon, saying that at the request of Congressman Lyndon Johnson, we have some excess budget money in the House Un-American Activities Committee. Johnson wants us to put this guy on the payroll as an informant. I found the House records on microfiche that record that Jack Rubenstein was indeed paid by the House Intelligence Committee, which is why Nixon recognized Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby is therefore directly connected to Congressman, later Senator, later Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Why am I not surprised? Well, we got to take one more break, Roger. When we come back, we'll talk about the RFK Jr., what his thoughts are on this. But I want to get your take on the latest plots to kill a president. They're very eerily similar to what you wrote about in this plot to kill John F. Kennedy in your book. I'll be right back with Roger Stone on The Rob Maness Show.
But with Brandon, it's always cutting edge stuff happening in the world, and it's not just from the political angle, because you can get that on other platforms, but it's always from the biblical angle. So you're dealing with a guy that loves Jesus, you're dealing with a guy that's very intelligent, you're dealing with a guy that is cutting edge conservatism, and you're dealing with a guy that wants to be biblical all at the same time. And so for that reason alone, I hope many, many people will not just lift up his ministry in prayer, but will also financially get behind it, because he, from the angle I'm trying to describe, he really is the only game in town. And we desperately need it in these last days. Can I get an amen to that?
My uncle, John Kennedy, he realized early on that the purpose of the CIA and the intelligence apparatus was to create a constant pipeline of new wars. Eisenhower, who was the outgoing president, gave what is probably the most important speech in American history, which was, where he warned against the military-industrial complex. I was at my uncle's inauguration. I was in Washington that day, a 6-year-old boy. And 2 months later, the military and intelligence came to him and said, we got to invade Cuba. And he was like, I'm not going to Cuba, and I'm not going to let the military. And they said, well, we got all these Cubans trained, and they're going to go attack Castro. And he said, well, the U.S. government can't be doing that. I don't like what Castro's doing down there, but it's not the United States' job to dictate what kind of governments other countries have. And they said, well, as soon as they land, there's going to be a big revolution. Everybody's going to rise up and they're going to overthrow Castro. And he said, well, you can't use the U.S. military. And they ended up bringing those guys over. And in the middle of it, in the night, they came to him and said, they're getting wiped out on the beach, and you need to send in the military and invade. And he said, we're not going to do it. He stepped out of that meeting, and he realized they had been lying to him and trying to trick him. And he said, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. For the next 1,000 days of his presidency, he was at war with his military and intelligence apparatus. They tried to get him to go into Laos. He said no. They tried to get him to go into Vietnam. They said that we need 250,000 combat troops. He refused. Everybody around him wanted him to go into Vietnam. He sent 16,000 military advisors. They weren't allowed to fight. Many of them did. They violated the rules of engagement. In October of 1963, he heard some of his Green Berets had been killed over there. And he said, I want a total casualty list from Vietnam. And his aide came to him and said, 75 Americans have died. He said, that's too many. And he signed that day a national security order ordering all troops out of Vietnam, U.S. troops. And then a month later, he was killed.
A month later, he was killed. Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. And my guest today is Roger Stone, and we're talking about his book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ. And Roger, I wanted to just devote a few minutes of this show to the bigger picture. And when I hear RFK Jr. in that entire clip I actually get emotional because I served, as you know, for over 32 years of my life as a teenager all the way up to 50 years of age in the U.S. Armed Forces, worked in the intelligence world as part of military intelligence units, worked at the Pentagon on the Joint Staff. I've seen the highest levels of classified material all the way up to the president and down. And I get emotional because I realize now, looking at the present day, in the context of your book, I think about this Crooks guy at Butler, Pennsylvania, and this Ruth guy who's still alive, that's connected to at least the Ukrainian intelligence services and the armed forces, that both attempted to kill President Trump. And I see very eerie similarities there, and it just makes me reel back and go, wow. The organization that I served in is probably a big part of what happened to both John F. Kennedy and what is happening today. And I'd like to get your take on that feeling that I have, because it's really bothering me.
Well, Rob, I think you're absolutely right. I agree with everything in that clip that Robert Kennedy says. There's one piece I think he is missing. The Bad Pigs invasion was initially planned under Dwight Eisenhower. The head of the working task force was Vice President Richard Nixon. But the plan included air cover from 29 Panamanian flag bombers that were supposed to be flown by Cuban pilots taking off from Panama. That is why, in the end, John Kennedy reluctantly approved the invasion plan. The day before the invasion, that air cover was canceled. That's why the men who were hitting the beaches were being cut to ribbons, also because the entire plan had leaked. So Castro knew when they were coming and where they were coming. It was then that Curtis LeMay went to John F. Kennedy and said, the only way to save the day here is to send in the Air Force. Kennedy had only approved the invasion plan with the theory of plausible deniability, that it not look like a U.S. invasion. So therefore, he rejected the request to send in the Air Force, and he took responsibility for what became a fiasco. In the larger sense, though, Rob, you're absolutely right. There is a direct line between the assassination of John Kennedy, the removal of Richard Nixon, who was threatening to dismantle the national security apparatus and take power away from the CIA, reflected both in his memoirs and in the diaries of his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, in the wake of the largest political victory, a landslide victory in a presidential contest in history in 1972. Declassified documents from the CIA now tell us that the CIA was well aware of the plan for the Watergate break-in, that they infiltrated the break-in burglar team, that 4 of the burglars were still on the payroll of the CIA and reporting to their handlers. By the way, Rob, the same 4 happened to be on the ground in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963. The same 4 men. How coincidental. So Nixon was removed in a silent coup. They attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan. I have a book coming out in July on the attempted assassination of Reagan, because there's never been an official report from the government. That we have a statement from Vice President George Bush saying that there was no conspiracy detected. That's interesting. And then you have these events both in Butler, Pennsylvania, and then again in West Palm Beach, where we just have more questions than we do have answers. But you're right about the similarities. Just as they took a hose and hosed out the back of John Kennedy's limousine immediately after he was murdered, they hosed down the roof of the building from which the shooter allegedly shot in Butler. Could it be that they don't want to have a DNA sample because Thomas Matthew Crooks is not the actual shooter? Looks like it to me. Then we're told that Crooks' cell phone is encrypted and we can't tell who else he was talking to and what he was saying. Apple refuses to turn over any of that information, saying it would be a violation of the late Mr. Crooks' rights, which is funny because Apple turned over all of the information from my cell phone and my computer to other investigators, and they didn't even get a subpoena for it. Kind of a double standard there. Look, why would the Secret Service, Homeland Security, and the local police all be on different radio frequencies in Butler so that they can't speak to each other? Why were the Secret Service aware that there was a man inside the perimeter for 92 minutes who'd been seen with both a rangefinder and a weapon, yet President Trump's direct Secret Service detail isn't informed and he isn't evacuated as would have been required under the Secret Service manual? I mean, there's so many questions here for which we lack answers. And then you have Mr. Routh, who they tell us is indigent, behind in his home payments, behind in his alimony payments. Who paid for him to fly to the United States? Who paid for him to fly to all of these European capitals where he is seen? I interviewed a witness who actually met him in the Maidan Square in Ukraine and had an exchange with him there. If he isn't a U.S. or Ukrainian intelligence asset, well, I'll kiss your derriere. I think it's pretty clear to me that the same forces, not the same people, obviously, but the same forces who killed Kennedy, who removed Nixon in a silent coup, who tried to kill Reagan and tried twice to kill Donald Trump, are one entity. And we need to know more about this. I really hope that President Trump will order the release of all of the documents pertaining to the attempted assassination of Reagan, because what I've learned in my research tells me that it is yet another CIA operation, in this case, one in which Vice President H.W. Bush plays the same role as Lyndon Johnson played in the murder of Kennedy.
And I've always thought motive and opportunity, and there it is. I've always thought that there was a possibility that H.W. Bush was involved in that, Roger. Well, here's an idea for another book, because, you know, as you mentioned forces that are involved in this, because the people that were running those agencies and machinery back in 1961, 2, 3, they're long gone. So it's some type of force that's enabled by policy, procedure, tactics, and techniques that is continued on to the present day. There's a book for you. What happened in 1963 that makes 2025 possible in the assassination of presidents world? And somebody's got to look at it, because we've got to get at that through President Trump's appointees or the next president's appointees and put it into this.
I don't disagree. It is very telling that the Kennedy Assassination Records Act that was passed in the mid-90s that required the release of all the documents pertaining to Kennedy's assassination in 2017 is thwarted by the CIA director, Mike Pompeo, who goes to President Trump and convinces him to hold back about 20% of the documents, saying that releasing those documents would expose the agency's methods and sources. Well, all the sources are dead, so that's absurd, but it would expose their methods, which is why the president, and he admitted this, regrets the fact that he didn't order the release then. I do think that his order for release of the documents is much too narrowly drawn. He only requires the release of the National Archives Kennedy Assassination Records collection. As I said earlier on the show, there's a lot of material missing there. We also see in these documents that have been released pertaining to the murder of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, the same pattern. Sirhan, the man convicted of killing Kennedy, is always in front of Robert Kennedy. He's also shooting widely. He gets off 8 shots. All 8 shots are accounted for. None of them hit Kennedy. Thomas Noguchi, who's probably the most famous coroner in the country, the LA County coroner, says an RFK is shot from behind at point blank range with the barrel of the gun right up against the back of his head. He was killed by a security guard, Thane Eugene Cesar, in my opinion. That is also the opinion of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Security guard hired by the Ambassador Hotel the week before Kennedy's murder, who immediately resigns and returns to his native Philippines immediately after the murder.
Well, we've got to get to the bottom of all this, sir. Unfortunately, we're out of time. ManWhoKilledKennedy.com. Mr. Stone says get the paperback, right, sir?
Yes, sir. You always want to get the paperback. If you go to themanwhokilledkennedy.com, you can get a signed copy. I'll even inscribe it to you personally if you so request. That's the best place to go for the book.
Well, thank you, sir. We appreciate it. The great Roger Stone, in his book about who really killed John F. Kennedy, I recommend you read it because it fits right into the context of what we are experiencing still today. And we've got to get to the bottom of that and fix it. There's one man that can help us do that right now. He's the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. I'll see you tomorrow on Whistleblower Wednesday. Dr. Mary Talley Bowden and her fight to end medical corruption amongst doctors, associations, pharmaceutical companies, and government.
You are watching Worldview 2.